They sat me at the far end of the table at the family gathering. 5 minutes later, everyone was speechless, and then I. The email sat in my old college inbox like a ghost I didn't know was still alive. I hadn't checked that account in years, maybe out of habit, maybe out of avoidance. My phone had buzzed with the alert, and when I opened it, there it was. A message from my parents, addressed formally and filled with words that felt like they came from strangers. Dear Cassidy, we're writing to let you know that in 3 weeks, there will be a family reunion hosted at your brother Jared's new estate in the hills outside Austin. We hope you can attend. It's the right thing to do. The note ended with Jared's address and the usual well wishes, as if the last decade of silence had never happened. I read it again, just to make sure it wasn't some prank or misfire, but the email address was correct, the signature at the bottom undeniably my mother's. My first instinct was to delete it and never look back. But then I did something I didn't expect. I closed my laptop slowly, walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown office, and just stared at the city I had built a life in. A far cry from the dirt-gray suburbs I'd been raised in, this view looked nothing like the one from my childhood bedroom. That night, after pouring myself a glass of wine and thinking more than I should have, I replied, for words, I'll be there. Cassidy. I don't know why I sent it. Maybe I was curious. Maybe I was angry. Maybe some small part of me still wanted to be seen. But the second I hit send, I felt my stomach twist into something I couldn't name. 11 years without a single call. 11 years since I walked out of that house with 3 cardboard boxes and no one offering to help carry them. And now they wanted to gather around Jared's fireplace and pretend we were a normal, loving family again. Growing up, I was the one they forgot about even when I was standing right there. Jared, 3 years older, had always been the bright light everyone circled around. He was good-looking, charming, athletic, and loud, the kind of guy who never had to try too hard to be liked. At family events, aunts and uncles crowded around him like he was a celebrity on a red carpet, while I hung back by the snack table, pretending to be busy with something unimportant. No one ever noticed when I disappeared halfway through those parties. I'd sneak off to sit in the hallway with a book, counting the minutes until we could leave. When I was 13, my Aunt Sierra called me the quiet one, with a tight smile, and my Uncle Zane responded, she's not quiet. She's just not interesting. They laughed like it was harmless, like words didn't stick like barbs to skin. By the time I was in high school, it was clear where the family's pride was invested. Jared got a full-blown fundraiser for his college tuition. Everyone chipped in like they were supporting a local hero. The day he got his acceptance letter to the University of Texas, my parents hosted a barbecue. There were banners, a cake, people giving speeches. When my acceptance letters came in 2 years later, I got a nod over breakfast. No mention of how I'd managed it with scholarships and straight A's. When I asked if they could help cover books, I got silence. 2 days later, they sat me down at the dining room table and told me there wasn't money for my college. Every cent had gone into Jared's tuition, his housing, and his bright future. I nodded. What else was there to do? I remember walking out of that conversation and getting dressed for work, my after-school job at a local diner called Murphy's. I took a double shift that night and never mentioned college again. The next 6 months were a blur of greasy aprons, aching feet, and customers who didn't bother learning your name. The worst were the familiar faces, cousins who'd come in just to mock me while ordering milkshakes and fries. Zane, now 20 and home from college, would call me service girl and leave napkins with notes like smile more. Might get you better tips. The final straw came on a Tuesday night. It was slow, and I was wiping down tables when Madison, another cousin, left a $2 tip with a receipt that read, "You should aim higher in life." I didn't cry until I got home, and even then, it wasn't sadness. It was fury, exhaustion, and a cold kind of clarity. That night, I told my parents I was leaving. I'd found a shared apartment on the east side with 2 other waitresses, and I'd already arranged a job at a new restaurant. I expected some resistance, some last-minute attempt at guilt, but they barely looked up. My mother said, "It's probably for the best," and my father muttered, "You're old enough to be on your own." They didn't ask for my address. I never gave it. Jared didn't call. I never expected him to. The apartment I moved into was crumbling at the edges and smelled like mildew during storms, but it was mine. I had my own key, my own space, and roommates who, like me, were clawing their way out of something. My new job was at a modest bistro called Juniper and Sage, owned by a woman named Marisol who ran the place like a ship with no patience for laziness or drama. She was sharp, blunt, and didn't care where you came from, only how you worked. I kept my head down, came in early, stayed late, and watched the kitchen like it was a classroom. 3 months in, Marisol called me into her office, a cramped room behind the storage pantry where the lights flickered if you leaned too hard on the desk. "You've got a spine," she said, tossing me a paper towel with my timesheet on it. "Most kids your age fold under pressure. You don't flinch." I nodded, not sure if it was a compliment or a warning. "I'm making you head server," she added. "Dollar raise. You'll manage the floor during lunch rush. Don't make me regret it." It wasn't much, but it was the first time in my life someone saw me as more than invisible. That raise paid for my half of a new mattress and covered my bus pass for the month. When I asked her if she thought I had what it took to run a restaurant, she looked me dead in the eyes and said, "You've got a storm inside you. Either you use it, or you let it drown you." I didn't drown. Instead, I registered for night classes in restaurant operations and management at a nearby community college. I studied in supply closets during my breaks, took exams on my phone in the alley behind the bistro, and begged for hours wherever they could be spared. Within 3 years, I wasn't just managing the bistro. I was helping Marisol open a second location across the river. 2 years after that, we opened a third, and Marisol signed the partnership papers in front of the staff on my 29th birthday, declaring me co-owner. The next morning, she told me, "Congratulations, boss," and handed me a ring of keys that felt heavier than they should have. Now, at 33, I live in a penthouse that overlooks the skyline. I drive a car I never let the valet park. I run a business that employs over 120 people. I speak at industry conferences. I'm interviewed in glossy magazines. I haven't spoken to my family in over a decade. Not because I couldn't, but because they never once reached out to say, "How are you doing?" And then, out of nowhere, they did. Or rather, they invited me to Jared's celebration, like I was a prop they'd forgotten in the attic. Not to apologize. Not to ask for forgiveness. Just to see if I'd show up and clap while Jared soaked in another round of applause. I didn't want to go, but I was going. The morning of the reunion arrived with a sky so blue it looked painted, like the universe had no idea what kind of day I was about to walk into. I stood in front of my closet, holding a sleek gray blouse between my fingers and wondering if it was too much. I didn't want to show up looking like I was trying to prove something, but I also refused to blend into the background like I used to. After a few minutes of deliberation, I settled on dark denim, a clean silk blouse, and a cashmere coat that hung perfectly off my shoulders without screaming price tag. The only flashy item I wore was my watch, a soft gold piece I'd bought for myself the day I signed the lease on our 5th restaurant location. Instead of taking my car, which probably would have turned too many heads in that neighborhood, I called a taxi. A small part of me wanted to arrive unnoticed, not because I was hiding, but because I didn't want the vehicle to speak louder than I would. I didn't need to announce my success. I could let them figure it out the hard way. The drive was quiet except for the occasional crackle of the driver's radio. I spent the ride rehearsing potential conversations in my head, preparing for the inevitable barrage of passive-aggressive questions and fake interest. I'd run through it a dozen times already. Stay calm, smile, don't bite. But I knew myself well enough to understand that if they pushed too hard, they'd get a version of me none of them had ever met before. Jared's new house was in a neighborhood I vaguely remembered visiting as a kid, back when Aunt Mel lived nearby. The area had been upgraded since then, tidy lawns, driveways with matching sedans, porch swings that probably never got used. His house was a 2-story brick colonial with plastic wreaths on the windows and an American flag hanging stiffly by the door. It looked exactly like the kind of place Jared would own, respectable, boring, and built to be shown off. I stepped out of the cab and walked up the driveway, feeling the heat of Texas spring under my boots. I rang the doorbell once, then stood back and waited. Inside, I could already hear the hum of conversation and occasional bursts of laughter. I imagined Jared holding court in the living room, while people took turns praising him for some middle-tier accomplishment dressed up in gold. After a few seconds, the door opened, and there she was, my mother, in an apron with a serving spoon in her hand, blinking at me like I was someone she hadn't expected to see. For a brief moment, I thought she might close the door again out of pure reflex. "Cassidy," she finally asked, like she wasn't sure if I was real or a trick of the light. I smiled softly and nodded. "Hi, Mom. It's good to see you." She stepped aside without another word, motioning me in as if I were just another guest, not the daughter she'd forgotten existed for over a decade. The house smelled like baked ham and overpriced candles. Pine and citrus, that strange combination meant to smell expensive, but really just overwhelmed the senses. The living room was crowded, bodies standing in tight clusters with plates of food and glasses of wine. I recognized most of the faces immediately. Uncle Troy, still loud and wearing that same awful leather jacket from every family photo. Aunt Madison with her stretched smile and glass of white wine already half gone. Then the cousins, Sierra and Zane. The same two who used to leave notes on my locker that said things like, "Silence isn't a personality." As I walked in, conversations tapered off slightly, then picked back up again in that awkward, fumbling way people pretend not to notice something unusual. But I saw the looks. They flickered across faces like shadows under a flickering light. I passed Aunt Madison, who leaned toward her husband and whispered something with a glance in my direction. I didn't need to hear the words. I'd spent enough time being that girl in the corner to know exactly how they framed me. Odd, pitiful, forgettable. Jared was in the center of it all, standing near the fireplace with a beer in hand, laughing at something Uncle Troy had said. When he finally noticed me, his face froze just for a beat before he pasted on a wide grin and stepped forward. Well, he said, eyes scanning me like he was trying to figure out what was different. "Cassidy finally decided we're worth her time." I tilted my head slightly, smiled just enough to be polite, and replied, "Congratulations on the new place. Looks like you've done well for yourself." His smile twitched. "Starter home," he said quickly. "Upgrading in a year or so when business picks up even more." They led us into the dining room for lunch, where two folding tables had been pushed together and covered in mismatched tablecloths. Plates were set out like a potluck, and Jared, of course, sat at the head of the table with our parents on either side. I was directed to the very end, squeezed next to a cousin I hadn't seen since middle school, and a child whose sole purpose seemed to be kicking the table leg beneath me. No one said much to me at first, except for occasional glances and polite nods. The conversation stayed centered on Jared, his new business, his house, his weekend trips, his potential to get into real estate next. My father stood and raised his glass, delivering a short toast that could have been lifted from a LinkedIn endorsement. "To Jared, who's made us proud since day one. From quarterback to businessman, you've never stopped impressing us." Everyone clapped. My mother followed up with something even more glowing, practically in tears over how driven and focused her son was. Then Uncle Troy added that Jared reminded him of himself back in the day, except, of course, more successful. Jared soaked it all in like he was being knighted. Eventually, his eyes drifted down the table toward me. He raised his glass, smirked slightly, and said, "And what about you, Cassidy? Want to say a few words? Tell us what the restaurant industry's like these days." His tone was all sugar-coated mockery, and everyone at the table picked up on it immediately. The chuckles started quietly, building like a ripple of permission. "Still waiting tables?" he added. "Or did they promote you to dishwasher yet?" Laughter exploded around me, like it was some inside joke I'd been too slow to catch. I heard Sierra mutter something about "still in an apron," and Zane snort hard enough to spill his drink. For a split second, I felt that old flush rise in my throat, that childhood instinct to fold inward and disappear. But I didn't. Not this time. Instead, I laughed. I laughed louder than anyone at the table, a full-bodied, honest laugh that silenced the room. My mother blinked at me, confused. Jared frowned, clearly unsure if he was being mocked or if I had finally lost my mind. "It's just funny," I said, still smiling. How none of you know anything about my life, and yet you all feel perfectly comfortable assuming the worst. I reached into my purse and pulled out one of my business cards, simple, white, with gold edges and my name at the top. I handed it to the cousin beside me and nodded. Pass that down to Jarrett. He might need to read it twice. The card began its slow journey down the table, moving from hand to hand, eyes widening as it passed. Whispered voices followed in its wake. When it finally reached Jared, he stared at it like it might burn his fingers. Cassidy Monroe, CEO and co-owner, Juniper and Sage Restaurant Collective, he read aloud, his voice dull, as if the words made less sense the longer he said them. My father leaned in, squinting. What does that mean? It means, I said clearly, that I own 6 restaurants across Texas, employ over 100 people, and am currently in negotiations to expand into 3 more states. It means I didn't stay a waitress. I built something. I took a sip of water and looked directly at Jared, and I didn't need any of you to do it. The silence that followed my words hung in the air like thick smoke, curling through every corner of the room, choking whatever was left of their smug amusement. I took another calm sip of water, gently set my glass down, and didn't flinch when no one spoke. My mother's mouth opened slightly, as if she was trying to form a response but had forgotten how to speak. My father cleared his throat, stared at the table for a beat too long, then looked up with a practiced smile, like someone trying to salvage a crumbling sales pitch. Well, he said, forcing a chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. That's quite impressive, Cass. You should have told us sooner. We're proud of you. I raised my eyebrows, the kind of expression that says more than words ever could. It's been 11 years, I replied, keeping my voice steady. And in all that time, not once did anyone pick up the phone or send a message asking how I was doing. Not one call on my birthday. Not one email when I moved. Not even a response to that voicemail I left 5 years ago. My mother quickly jumped in, her voice higher than usual, trembling somewhere between defensiveness and guilt. Oh, sweetheart, that's not true. We thought you needed space. We didn't want to push. I gave a dry laugh, quiet but sharp. You didn't push because you didn't care. Let's not pretend it was anything more complicated than that. Suddenly, the table became a flurry of awkward movements, cutlery scraping plates, wine glasses being refilled too quickly, fake coughs trying to fill the silence. My cousin Sierra glanced down at her lap, as if she could disappear by looking small enough. Zane, for once in his life, didn't have a snide comment ready. Jared sat there frozen, his face locked in a tight grimace like someone trying to process the idea that the little sister he used to mock in front of relatives now had more power, more presence, and more success than he ever could have predicted. And then, like clockwork, the rewrites began. My mother, regaining her composure in that smooth, practiced way she used to explain away Jared's high school fights, leaned toward me with a bright smile that didn't match the panic in her eyes. You should stay longer, Cassidy. We have so much catching up to do. I'd love to hear more about your company. It sounds wonderful. So inspiring. I glanced at the clock on the far wall and made a point to stand slowly, brushing my hands down my coat like I'd just finished a long but satisfying meeting. I have an early meeting tomorrow morning, I said, already stepping away from the table. I didn't plan on staying long. But you just got here, my father said, standing with me, his voice laced with something that sounded like hope but was really desperation. Let's talk more. This is a big deal. We're all proud of what you've done. I paused near the front hallway, my purse slung over one shoulder, and turned to face them again. Pride is easy now that you see numbers attached to my name, I said. But where was that pride when I was begging for help to buy textbooks? Where was it when I spent 2 years serving fries to the same cousins who left me notes calling me a failure? No one answered. They didn't need to. The truth was already smeared across their faces like cheap foundation on a hot day. They knew it, and I knew they knew it. As I reached for the door, my mother's voice called after me, softer now, trying to reach some emotional place that no longer existed. Cassidy, please. We want to make things right. We're a family. I turned slowly and met her eyes with a kind of clarity that only comes when you've stopped waiting for people to change. No, Mom, I said gently. You want access to the version of me you ignored while she was becoming this. You don't want to make things right. You want to feel better about not trying sooner. She blinked, her hand still holding the edge of the tablecloth like it was a lifeline. The taxi was already waiting in the driveway when I stepped outside. I gave the driver a nod, slid into the back seat, and exhaled like I'd been holding my breath the entire afternoon. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of Jared standing at the doorway, still holding my business card like it might turn to ash if he let go. Back at my apartment. Home. Really. I kicked off my boots, tossed my purse on the armchair, and let out a laugh that came from somewhere deeper than relief. It wasn't cruel or vengeful. It was freedom. It was a sound I hadn't heard from myself in years. I poured myself a drink and replayed the moment that card made its way around the table. The confusion, the growing tension, the dawning horror, the instant shift in tone, like someone had pulled back the curtain to reveal the strings behind the puppet show. The next morning, I woke to 5 missed calls, all from unknown numbers, and 17 text messages. 3 were from my mother, 4 from my father, 2 from Jared. The rest were aunts and uncles and cousins, all suddenly full of curiosity, interest, and poorly written apologies. I didn't respond. I had work to do, deadlines to meet, expansion plans to finalize. I hadn't needed their validation to succeed, and I certainly didn't need it now. But they didn't stop. By the end of the week, the messages had multiplied. Some were dripping with guilt. Long paragraphs about forgiveness and reconnection, all of them loaded with carefully chosen phrases like, "We always loved you," and "We just didn't know how to reach out." Others were almost transactional, with thinly veiled questions about the business. How big was it? Where were we expanding next? How many employees? And then came Jared's message. Unlike the others, it was direct and desperate. He was expanding his auto parts business, apparently struggling to secure funding from investors, and thought maybe I could help. Not because we were siblings, he said, but because I was clearly someone with financial influence. He attached a draft of his business plan, written in Comic Sans, with barely legible margins and half the numbers just labeled TBD. At the bottom, he offered to pay me back, with interest, of course. I didn't respond. A day later, he texted again. "Did you get my message?" I replied with one word. "No." Then I blocked his number. It should have felt cold, maybe even petty, but the truth is, it didn't. It felt like placing a final stone in a wall I'd been quietly building for over a decade. Not a wall to hide behind, but one to stand on top of. 2 weeks after the reunion, I found myself curious enough to check Jared's public profile. I hadn't thought about it since the night I left, but something told me he wouldn't be able to keep quiet. I was right. There it was, a long, self-pitying post on social media about certain family members who had forgotten their roots and let success turn them arrogant. The comments section was full of sympathetic reactions from the usual suspects: Sierra, Zane, a few second cousins I barely remembered. All of them chiming in with performative empathy, like they were sharing in some noble struggle. I laughed again, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly what I expected. They hadn't changed. They probably never would. But I had. I clicked out of the browser, turned back to the pitch document I was reviewing for our new flagship location, and let that chapter stay closed. They could keep their performances. I had work to do. 2 months passed without another word from Jared or my parents, at least not directly. A few mutual acquaintances, people I hadn't spoken to since high school, the kind who always stayed within the orbit of small-town gossip, started liking my LinkedIn posts, commenting vague praise under photos from Juniper and Sage's new flagship opening in San Antonio. A couple of them even sent messages that began with, "Wow, so proud of you," followed by some flimsy attempt at reconnecting or asking if I was hiring. I ignored all of it. My silence wasn't revenge. It was simply a boundary I had finally learned to respect. Marisol and I were sitting in our downtown office, finalizing lease terms for our upcoming culinary training center, when my assistant knocked and passed me a handwritten message on company stationery. It said simply, "Your mother called the office. Twice. She asked to speak with you directly." I read the note and placed it quietly beside my keyboard. Marisol didn't comment. She knew enough of the story by now to understand exactly why I didn't react. Over the next few days, the calls increased, some to my office, others to my personal number, which I'd foolishly kept unchanged all these years. The voicemail transcripts read like a roller coaster of emotional strategy. Some were soft-spoken appeals about wanting to be a family again. Others dipped into guilt, reminders of birthdays spent together or lines like, "No one stays mad forever, sweetheart." But there was a shift I could sense through all of it, an urgency, a panic brewing under their words that hadn't been there before. I finally answered one call, more out of exhaustion than anything else. It was my mother, voice tight with rehearsed sweetness that had once felt like home, but now sounded like a stranger's. "Cassidy," she said, breathless with relief, "finally. I've been trying to reach you. We're all worried. We think it's time to talk." I stayed quiet for a moment before answering. "Why now?" She paused, caught off guard by the directness of my question. "Because we miss you. Because you're still our daughter." I laughed softly, without warmth. Where was this concern when I called you crying after Christmas my first year alone? When I asked if I could join, and you said it would be awkward because no one asked about me? There was a long silence, the kind that hums with the vibration of a lie collapsing before it can be spoken. "Cassidy, that was a misunderstanding," she finally said, her tone shifting slightly, sharpening around the edges. "You're being unfair. You've changed, and we understand that. But don't forget who helped raise you." The word helped hit me like a slap. "Helped?" I repeated. "You didn't pay for my books, didn't drive me to job interviews, didn't even ask where I moved after I left. You didn't help. You left me alone." Her next words came through clenched teeth, the sweetness finally cracking. "You should be more grateful. You wouldn't be where you are if we hadn't taught you resilience." That was when I hung up. I didn't slam the phone down or scream. I simply pressed the button, set it on the counter, and walked away. The next day, I had my assistant block the number. I told her, plainly and without hesitation, "If they call again, don't answer. And block any new ones that follow." She nodded without comment, slid the notepad into her desk, and never brought it up again. Then Jared came crawling back. Not through calls. He probably knew better than to try. But through email, where he could put on a performance in well-crafted paragraphs and attach his latest business plan. It came with a subject line that read, "Let's talk, one entrepreneur to another." I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. The message was 3 paragraphs of exaggerated flattery, vague references to the past, and a pitch that he needed a private investment to expand his online auto parts business into something disruptive and scalable. I scrolled to the bottom without reading half of it and saw the bolded sentence, "If you're willing to fund $90,000 upfront, I can guarantee a 20% return by next year." I stared at it for a full minute, letting the irony settle in. This was the same man who mocked me in front of our relatives, who once left a joke tip on a diner table with my name written next to a sad face. This was the same man who smirked across the reunion table while suggesting I must have been promoted to dishwasher. And now he wanted almost $100,000, because suddenly, I had value. I didn't reply. He followed up 3 days later with, "Just checking if you saw my last message." I typed a single word, "No," and hit send before blocking his email address too. That night, I went for a walk through downtown with a coffee in hand, listening to the buzz of the city that had shaped me. Everywhere I looked, I saw something that had come from nothing. A mural on a once-abandoned wall, a bakery that used to be a boarded-up liquor store, a busker playing a song that reminded me of waiting tables until midnight. Everything around me was living proof that growth could come from neglect. And it reminded me that I didn't owe anyone an explanation for how I got here. The following week, a message popped up in my inbox from one of Jared's friends, someone I hadn't seen since high school. A guy named Marcus who used to come over and drink all our soda while bragging about his truck. He sent a vague apology on Jared's behalf, claiming he was under a lot of pressure and regretted how the reunion went down. I deleted it immediately, not because it wasn't sincere, maybe it was, but because it didn't matter. These people weren't reaching out because they missed me. They were reaching out because their assumptions had been shattered, and now they were scrambling to reframe the story. They wanted to rewrite the narrative, to cast me as the prodigal daughter who'd finally returned, successful and softened, ready to forgive and forget. But I hadn't returned. I had walked in, told the truth, and walked out again, on my terms, with nothing left unsaid. And still, they didn't stop. My Uncle Troy emailed next, rambling about family ties and how blood was thicker than pride. He signed off with, "Don't be a stranger," as if he hadn't laughed when Jared humiliated me in front of everyone. Madison, ever the PR-friendly cousin, sent a DM asking if she could visit one of our restaurants and maybe do a blog write-up. I wanted to reply with the tip receipt she left me all those years ago, the one that read, "You'll never get anywhere with that attitude." But I didn't. I blocked her instead. The more they reached out, the clearer it became. This wasn't about healing. It was about access. They wanted proximity to something they had once dismissed because now it came with press mentions and glowing profiles. Now it looked like success. And success, to people like them, was magnetic, even if they were the ones who tried to bury it before it ever had a chance to grow. I spent the next few nights finalizing plans for our culinary school. Marisol and I had been dreaming about it for years, but now it was real. Land acquired, architects hired, a mission statement written and rewritten until it felt like gospel. The idea wasn't just to train chefs. It was to teach leadership, responsibility, the kind of grit they don't cover in hospitality textbooks. I wanted to build something that gave other kids what I never had, a place to belong before they became something that others wanted to claim. The last message came in late one Thursday night, almost 5 weeks after Jared's embarrassing email pitch had been deleted and forgotten. I had just finished reviewing a proposal for our culinary school scholarship fund and was getting ready to shut down for the evening when my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from an unknown number, short, unnerving, and unmistakably her. "Cassidy, I've been doing a lot of thinking. I'd really like to talk." I stared at the message for a long moment, not because I didn't recognize the tone, but because I recognized it all too well. That soft, rehearsed guilt, polished with just enough vulnerability to make you question yourself. My mother had always been an expert at planting doubt in the middle of apology. The kind of apology that doesn't come from regret, it comes from discomfort, from being ignored. I didn't respond. Not right away. I left the phone where it was and walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood by the window. Outside, the skyline was alive, lights blinking across the dark like signals from another world. This city had been the backdrop of my becoming, every mile of it paved with hours they never witnessed, with victories they never asked about. They weren't part of my success. They were the reason I had to build it from the ground up. When I came back to my desk, the phone buzzed again. Another text. Longer this time. "I know we made mistakes. I just don't want to lose my daughter forever. I still love you. Please let me fix this before it's too late." I sat down slowly, reading the words again and again. There was a time, years ago, when a message like that would have shattered me. I would have clung to it, examined it for sincerity, dissected it for hidden meanings, hoping it meant something more than it did. Back then, I was starving for even the illusion of love. But now, reading it didn't bring sadness. It brought silence, the kind that follows closure. I never responded. Not to her. Not to the others. There was no confrontation, no big moment of finality, no dramatic farewell. Just distance. A quiet, intentional decision to keep the door closed, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Marisol and I launched the culinary school 3 months later. We held a ribbon-cutting ceremony outside the brand-new facility, right next to our flagship restaurant, with dozens of young applicants watching from the crowd. I gave a speech that day, something short and honest, about where I came from and why we built this place. I didn't mention my family by name, but they were there, between the lines, in every sentence about obstacles and resilience. I spoke for the kids who had been overlooked, written off, underestimated by people who were supposed to protect them. When I stepped down from the podium, the applause felt different, earned, not expected. The school filled quickly. Students from every background walked through those doors, some with culinary dreams, others just trying to escape situations like mine. I made a point to be present, to talk to them. to make sure none of them ever felt like they were invisible. Watching them grow, watching their hands learn, their voices strengthen, their confidence emerge. It gave me something I hadn't realized I was still missing. Not validation, not recognition, just meaning, just proof that survival could become something bigger than itself. A year later, during an industry event in Chicago, I ran into a woman who used to be one of Jared's mentors. She introduced herself at the cocktail hour, told me she knew my brother, and then asked if I was the famous sister she'd heard about. I laughed, genuinely, not bitterly, and said, "Depends who you ask." She smiled politely and said Jared had mentioned me once during a business pitch, but not by name. Just that he had a sister who got lucky in the restaurant business. I thanked her for telling me, then politely excused myself to refill my glass. I didn't think about it again until I got back to Austin. It was just another thread in the story they were trying to spin, a way to dull the shine of what they couldn't understand. But I didn't need them to understand. That was never the goal. They could lie to the world if it made them feel less small. I'd already told the truth, to myself, to the people who mattered, and to the life I'd built from the ground up. One quiet Sunday evening, I found myself back in the office alone, the building mostly empty, the hum of the city distant but constant. I was going through some financials when my assistant popped her head in, holding a sheet of paper with a sheepish look. "One last thing before I go," she said, passing it to me. "A handwritten letter came in this morning. No return address. Just your name on the envelope." I didn't have to open it to know where it came from. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, slightly slanted, always with a flourish under the Y in my name. I let it sit on my desk for almost an hour, unopened, while I finished work. When I finally did tear the seal, I unfolded 3 pages of careful penmanship that danced between apology, self-pity, and subtle reminders of obligation. My mother had written it. She talked about time lost, about wanting to visit, about Jared being in a difficult place lately. She even slipped in a line about my father missing me, but being too proud to admit it. The final paragraph was the part that made me pause. "I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive us. After all, no matter what happened, we're still your family." I folded the letter back into the envelope, slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk, and left it there. I didn't need to burn it, tear it, or throw it away. I didn't need to write back or say anything at all. That letter wasn't a key to a door I wanted to reopen. It was just another artifact from a life that no longer belonged to me. Instead, I walked to the windows of my office and looked out at the skyline. The lights shimmered, the streets buzzed, the buildings stood tall, silent witnesses to every step I'd taken to get here. The journey had been brutal. It had been lonely, but it had also been mine. And that was the real difference between me and them. They had inherited their comfort. I had built my freedom. They had been given the benefit of the doubt. I had earned every inch of belief in myself. They wanted a family reunion so they could pretend the past had never happened. I walked away from that table so I wouldn't have to keep pretending anymore. They will always tell themselves that I changed, that success made me cold, made me arrogant, made me forget who I was. But the truth is simple, even if they can't face it. I didn't change. I revealed myself. I became the version of me that had been buried beneath their indifference for years. The quiet girl in the corner didn't disappear. She learned how to stand, how to speak, how to build. And now she's the one holding the pen. I turned off the lights in my office, grabbed my bag, and stepped into the elevator. No calls to return. No debts to repay. No ghosts left to chase. Only tomorrow, and everything I was still building.